Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Thank you. So let me start this way. So how many of you think that the weather this year has been really unusual? Anyone? See a lot of hands going up, right? Some of you have lived here a long time, but the real question is, are we right? So how could we tell? Right? How could we decide whether, are we right that the weather, because every year there's always a few weird days. Did we just have more of them cluster together this year differently than other years? So maybe, we always get a few days that are hotter than they should be, a few days that are colder. That's just kind of the natural variance of weather. But maybe this year we had the same number of them, they just sort of all came together. Or maybe it really is crazy and we're seeing hot and cold varying. Maybe we're only seeing differences in the winter, but not in the summer. Maybe we're only seeing differences on how much it rains on the rainy days. This certainly has felt like a very rainy year. We've had these huge downbursts, but have we seen more total rain? Well, we can go, so if we want to understand this stuff, what we can start doing is going out and collecting information. And for weather, that's pretty easy, right? There's these things that every day, when the weatherman gets up in front of the TV and says, this is the prediction, he also has, here's what happened yesterday. And so you have weather watchers, you have things, but how do you pull that information together? So first of all, where are we looking? Are we looking Albany? Are we looking Colonie? Are we looking New York State? Are we looking the whole US? Are we looking Northeast? So the questions about data have always been, what data do I pull in and collect? What information do I get that will help me figure out answers to questions like these? And even more importantly, once I can start answering questions like these, can I tell you what next year will look like? Or, there's a lot of people predicting what our winter is going to look like this year, but who do I trust? How do I know what is really going to happen? So what's happened in the past is because we didn't really have the big enough computers and the things to do this right, we would pull little bits of the data. So we'd say, okay, well, it's hard to do the whole United States. We can do Albany pretty well. Does Albany look different? Well, okay, getting all of the weather for Albany by every minute of the day or every hour of the day is very hard. So let's just get daily averages. So now what we've done is we've taken some information. So now we're going to look at how have we done in average this year versus an average other years, and we might see a difference. But the more that we can collect, the more that we can look at, the better we can do at trying to figure out what's going on for real. So if we could actually get minute by minute data coming from all the sensors we have there and pull it into one big computer somewhere, then that computer can do a bunch of math on it and can say, at this time of day, on these dates, we're seeing something funny, but even better, we can start answering the questions like I was asking at the beginning. Are we seeing something unusual this year? So we need data from past years. We need data as far back as we can go, because maybe 1922, 23, 24, and 25 were all, just like this, but we don't remember because most of us weren't around back then. Maybe this year is really very similar to years we've seen elsewhere over the years if we only look at a big enough window. So maybe if we look at 5-year time frames, the past 5 years aren't that different. It's just this year feels different because we're, in a sense, averaging out. Right? So it's a very hard thing to sort of say, how do we look at these? What does the math look like? But what's changed over the past decade, and what the book is really about, is that we've been getting better and better at collecting the data. So the idea isn't a new idea. In fact, they keep going back to an example in the book of a Navy midshipman named Maury, who basically he got injured on shipboard, was sort of grounded, ended up working for the government, and he was the guy who was supposed to figure out what was going on in shipping and stuff, and he started realizing that every captain of every ship would go out on their travels, and this was not, recent, so this is back, it was all wind ships and things like that, and they'd do their thing, they'd go to Europe or wherever, they'd come back, they'd have a day by day, literally hour by hour, log of what happened. But the captain was using that information to say, what happened when I sailed here before? Where are sandbars? What's going on? So they were looking at a very narrow thing. He started collecting those logs and sort of putting them up on a big chart. He started saying, you know, whenever a ship seems to go out in June, it comes back sooner than when it goes out in July. Or we seem to not, or more often than not, because it's not, usually it's not that clean. It's not every June, every July. But he said, when we start looking at 100 or a few hundred ship movements day by day, we start to see patterns that we don't see in the individual log. So that idea has been around for a long time. And the math for doing that has been around and growing for a long time. What's changed is how much stuff you can put in there. Right, so now the computer, I got a phone here somewhere, there it is. You've got to be careful with phones when you're giving this kind of talk. No, this pocket, there it is. So this thing has 16 gigabytes of memory in that. To put in perspective, I graduated from college 35 years ago. There weren't 16 gigabytes of memory in the whole world. Right? So I've got more stuff in this phone. I've got more stuff in my watch than the big computer I use. And my watch isn't a calculator. It's just to have the thing that accurately keeps the time and knows that today it should be, you know, it's a month with 30 days, so I don't have to actually set my watch once every few months like I did with it. That computer power that's in there to make that happen is as much computer power as we used to have in big computers that did government things. In fact, most of it sits idle because the watch doesn't need it. So the amount of things we can store, okay, the amount of memory we have available, and the amount of power we have to process it has been growing exponentially, has been growing, doubling every year or a couple years. Not in a line like this, but in a line like that. And that line gets bigger and bigger, faster and faster. So what the authors are saying in this book is, when you take this kind of analysis, this ability to collect data, and look at it like we have for 100 years, but start to bring it bigger, right? Supersize it, as it were, right? A lot happens. And they say, and there's really two different trends going on that they name big data. One is just getting a lot of stuff, right? So the more you have, in some ways, the better off you are. And I'll give you a couple examples in a minute. The other one is, even if you don't have a lot, now we have powerful enough computers that we can analyze all of it. So there's a big difference between, as I said before, taking all of the weather data and looking at it carefully, or sampling it. Because when you can take all of the data, so if I decided to try to figure out what people in this audience felt about something, well, if I used a traditional polling approach, I would pick a few people at random and say, what do you think? And I'd say, okay, that probably represents the crowd. And the more people in the room, if there were, it turns out the numbers work well in your favor. So if you have 1 million people, you can ask only about 600 or 700 of them and supposedly get a good answer. The problem is, what I could miss is that there's 3 people in the corner back there who really hated something. And there's 3 people in this corner who really love it, because when I took the averages, I got I wasn't able to see that sort of, think about it almost as the local weather within the room. But if I asked everybody, and again, if there's 20 people in the room, that's easy. If there's 200 people in the room, that's harder. If there's 2 million people in the room, how do I ask everybody? Right? But if I could, then instead of trying to guess, instead of having a poll that said plus or minus 3%, I would get something that says, here's exactly what's going on. And I could recognize special patterns in there. I could see the patterns like the ones Maury found about ships. So I could say, hey, you know, people living in this particular area with this particular kind of car seem to have a very different opinion than everyone else. Now, that brings up a couple interesting questions. Question number one is, when you see those patterns, what do they tell us? Right? So this is called correlation. The pattern, the example they use in here is, Walmart discovered, when they were looking at all their their customer data, whenever a hurricane was coming, so we had Sandy and Irene in the past few years, right? Walmarts sell a lot of Pop-Tarts right before hurricanes. No one knows why. You could make up reasons. We might be right. You might say, hey, people want something that's better if they have electricity, but they can still eat if they don't have electricity. Or maybe people want something that you won't have to throw away after a storm. Or we can come up with 100 answers. Walmart doesn't care. Walmart now, if they know a hurricane has been predicted in your area, when you walk in the store, you will see Pop-Tarts prominently displayed, because they know people buy a lot of So from a certain point of view, if you just know that when this happens, that can be very valuable for making business decisions. But you don't know why. And what these guys are arguing is maybe we spent too much of our time in science, in business, in society, wondering about the whys instead of the whats. So again, what's wonderful about the book, big data, Victor Mayer-Schonberger, because I can never remember how to pronounce his name, Schonberg, and Ken Cukier. Ken's a friend. He works for The Economist magazine. And basically the way this worked, I just wish I'd been smart enough to have done it first, is they kind of met, and Victor knew a lot about the world of data, and Ken knew how to make it so people could actually read it and understand it. So the whole book is based mostly around anecdotes, no math, right? Nothing that says, here's how to do it. It's all what it does. I'm very jealous because they're doing they're selling a lot of them. But the idea is that we've always had this fixation on causality because we assume, because we're sampling, that we have to understand what's going on for it to be very useful. So if you only look at a few things people buy, you might not see the Pop-Tarts to hurricanes, because you need to look at a lot of data to see that, because hurricanes aren't very frequent. And they weren't looking for what do people buy in hurricanes. They were just looking for, is there anything unusual about when we see sales of something different than we usually see it? So they're looking, in a sense, mathematically at every product they sell and say, where do you see something that looks unusual? So in Pop-Tarts, you're going along, selling like usual, up a little, down a little. Suddenly there's something like that. You'd say, what's going on here? And then they have lots of other data. So they have where this is happening, things like that. And they start to notice, hey, it seems to be correlating with this weather stuff. Now they have a thing that they can use, but they still don't have an explanation. And so what the authors argue is maybe we don't need those explanations all the time. Maybe we're moving towards a world where the data makes predictions that help us know what's going on well enough that we don't have to worry about the whys. And there's a lot of examples of that, both in the book, outside the book. Down in the city, Con Edison spends a huge amount of money fixing pipes that break. You've all seen the news articles when a manhole goes shooting up in the air and something underneath has happened. And when that happens in New York City, whole buildings have to shut down their water, their electricity. It costs them a huge amount of money. So they had to have a thing that says, let's always send some guys down to inspect pipes and we'll fix what looks broken. But they started collecting the data of where were those things happening, where had the guys been, things like that. And they started finding out that using this very big model, and no, it doesn't just say hurricanes and weather. It says when these 100 things all line up the following way, you're more likely to see an explosion. So now what they do is they collect that data, and whenever they see 50, 60, 70 there, they get someone in there to start doing the repair before the problem starts. Now, why can't they do that everywhere? Well, you can't repair all the pipes all the time. It's too expensive. So something that predicts where the pipes is going to break saves them literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year. But the problem becomes, if you want to build a new pipe, it doesn't tell you how or why. It just says, this is where to go. So what the world is exploring at the moment is how this kind of notion of having a lot of data, using it to look at a whole picture and get a feel for the problem, helps change things. And again, in some cases, we're very worried about the causal model. In medical informatics, they use a few examples from basically healthcare issues. So you find when people in hospitals have had a certain thing happen, the nurses did this or the doctors did that, more people got better and the costs went down. You might say, I want to keep doing that. Okay. On the other hand, when I'm looking at something like, say, one of the things people are doing, we're doing a project in this up at RPI, is we're looking at when you have a lot of patient data and you say, this person had this disease and they got better. Let's look not at what we were treating them for that disease, but let's look at everything they were being treated by. And what we find sometimes is that a bunch of people who had this disease and a different disease got better, had a better healthcare return or a worse healthcare return than people who had just this alone. So what we might do is start looking at what drug were they getting here and what drug were they getting here. So maybe that combination of drugs is better against this disease. So now we have that correlation information. The question becomes, should we start treating people that way? No, because we can't explain it. Once you start looking at that, though, very often the scientists can go back and say, I get it. Here's what's going on. You know, this drug has this property. And this. So if you put them together, it makes sense that they're helping this other thing. Or you might say, let's test it. Let's go do some clinical tests. Let's try to see what happens. And so a lot of things are being discovered now about drugs, or very often you find, you know, that drug plus that drug helped a little bit, but now that we understand what's going on, we can design something that really helps. So a lot of changes are happening in medicine, in customer things. So one model is you're just taking the data, you're putting it in there, it gives you predictions, and you make money off of those. So businesses love that. Second thing that's happening is we're taking data that was collected. For one thing, we're saying, what else can it tell us? So that's the second big theme of the book. So the first theme is that taking all the data, and that we can now do that, makes a big difference in how well we can predict things from data. The second theme is that that we can discover things from data that was collected for one purpose that helps us with a different purpose. And they use a lot of interesting examples. One of the examples that they use is a car company was doing some stuff to design seats. So they built a sensor that went into the seat that could tell sort of the position of the person sitting in the seat, right? And they were using that just when they were doing the design. But now to do that design, they had put lots of people in lots of those seats. And by the way, when they started building the seats into the cars, they figured, why not leave the sensor in there? Because then what we do is we get data back from all the people who bought our cars, whether they're comfortable or not, because we can tell if they're slouching or not. They suddenly start discovering that they can tell things about, you know, when people were driving at certain speeds, how were they sitting? When people had accidents, were they in a different position than when they didn't? So suddenly this thing that was designed just so they could build a more comfortable seat is helping them reduce traffic accidents. It's helping them do other things than what the data was planned for. So traditionally in science, data is collected, the thing you're trying to prove is proved, the data is thrown out, and you go on to the next thing. And now people are saying, let's start saving that data, and not just in science, but everywhere. So they talk about, and I won't go into the details of this, they talk about sort of a whole bunch of business models. Companies, so they say, so there's the company that collects the data for the sake of the data they want. There's the other next organization that wants to use that data for something else, collects that data from different things and puts it together and is able to do second things with the same data. And they go on to some other examples like that. A good example of that to think about, not so much discussed in the book, but I was asked about by someone earlier today, the election. You know, why was it that Nate Silvers did so well compared to other pollsters? And what he did is he collected information from lots of different polls. But even more interesting is when you look at what the political campaigns were doing, that was different. So for years, people have been calling people and saying, what do you think? Right? And collecting that information, we know, hey, we're seeing a pattern here, so we know we want to get these people out to the polls, or we want to do this. But what the Obama campaign did in the last election is they started correlating what they were learning from their phone banks with what they could learn from the data that they had bought about people. That includes election data, but that also, I hate to tell you how much data about you is available online, and a lot of it is sold between companies. But they started saying things like, you know, an area where we seem to see a lot of voters who are leaning towards Obama but not convinced yet is in this particular demographic set. What could we do to get those voters excited? Right? And some of these were things you might not even think of. So for example, in the California region, they were not winning a certain demographic of women of a certain age group, right? So all of a sudden they had this thing which said, if you donate to Obama, you could win a date, you could win getting invited to a party with George Clooney. Because they had learned from the marketing guys who they were talking to that for that demographic, George Clooney was the exciting person. So suddenly they started getting donations from those women who wanted to win the party. By the way, those women also, when you donate to something, you get more, you tend to be more convinced that maybe I should, I wouldn't give a, I'm not really sure who I'm going to vote for, but I'm giving this guy money, maybe I should vote for him. So essentially they were using a lot of different kinds of information, put it together. To get East Coast, one of the things they were worried about is working class males. So you'll notice the next raffle they ran was Sarah Jessica Parker. So again, these things were done with science behind them. Now, the decision to use that particular actor or actress, that was something done using human intuition. But the fact that where we're having a problem is this segment of the society was done by taking the small samples they were getting on the phone and matching those to people and then looking at the clusters of people and saying, so what can we tell about this cluster of people that these guys represent? So by getting more data, pulling it together, they were able to get a better secondary use. They were able to put it together with other kinds of data. So first thing is being able to pull a lot of data together and correlate it. Second thing is to take data that was collected for one reason, integrate it or bring it together and use it for a second reason, or multiple reasons. And then the third thing they talk about is actually the obvious thing that follows from that. What about the threat? What are the threats of this new data world? And in fact, of the things in this book that I think are, there's a lot I love about this book. I'm less happy with their discussions of sort of the ethical and privacy things. So what they talk about is primarily the fact that using data, you get better at predicting things. And they've used some examples because law enforcement is very interested in this. So law enforcement starts finding out that when we take the arrest data and put it through this kind of analysis, we discover that on Tuesday nights between 11 and 1, crime seems to be higher in this neighborhood. So now we start putting more unmarked patrol cars out in that neighborhood at that time. Our arrests go up and the crime in that neighborhood goes down. So that's a great thing for those of us who are looking at it from the point of view of reducing crime. It's not such a great thing from the criminals, but that seems okay to us generally. But now extrapolate from that. Now say, as that gets more and more precise, you start saying, if you see somebody walking on this street at this time, maybe they're a criminal. So you start taking them in preemptively. Or, when I look at this population, maybe not in the US, but in some other countries, I see some, well, actually here in New York City, right, the stop and frisk. Why those particular people are picked is, you might say, well, it seems obvious because it seems to be a big ethnographic thing. This is this particular ethnic or this particular thing. But actually, when you look at it more closely, they did more of that analysis and said it's men in this age from these ethnic groups in these places at these times. So they're able to do more stop and frisk. Well, but now you're starting to say, now wait a minute. We're presuming that somebody is there and in that space at that time. Of course, most of the people stopped and frisked aren't arrested. Right? So what we've done is we've targeted a very particular population. Well, now keep taking that further and further. What about when you get that down to, somebody in this room wearing a green shirt with sneakers is more likely to be a criminal than anyone else. Look around the room, guys. Right? There's no, and again, remember, we don't know why. We just know that's what the data is telling us. So if the cops came and pulled him away saying, we think you might be a troublemaker, the rest of us would say, wait, something seems wrong here, especially as it could have been any one of us. So they talk a lot about, what would it mean to think about predicting the future based on data and starting to really act on it. And how does that affect us as individuals? And I think that's sort of a problem. And it's interesting. But they really skirt the bigger issue. What is privacy? What does it mean when all this is being collected? So just came out this past weekend that if you have a Easy Pass, okay, that in New York City for a very long time now, at a lot of intersections, they've been collecting Easy Pass data. right? Because it lets them figure out how many cars are going past what place at what time, and they've been putting that into traffic models, and they've been using that to improve the traffic flow in New York City. And they say that, we get the data in encoded form, so we can't tell what the actual license plate was, and we only keep it for a few minutes and things like that. So now we can argue over whether that collection thing, but when you bought your Easy Pass, you weren't thinking that you were going to help them make traffic better in New York. You thought, I'm going to get through tolls faster, right? Who else is collecting that data? In fact, the guy who exposed this did it by building his own Easy Path reader. So he had in his car something that he could drive around with. It was about this size, had a little cow on it that mooed whenever somebody checked his Easy Path, and discovered it was being used at a lot of places. It seemed to be mooing a lot, not just at toll booths. New York City was where it was doing it the most, and so that he reported that, and that's how this was caught. He now has lent it to a friend who's driving across country to say, where else will you see this happening? But now think about it. That doesn't feel like a very big privacy violation, but it starts to feel a little bit eerie. We didn't say we wanted our data collected for that. Well, what about when I just told you that Obama, and by the way, the McCain campaign did it too, just not as well. So in the next election, you bet a lot more money has been put on the Republican side to improve that. So by the next campaign, that'll be almost even again. So again, all the data about you, they can get their hands on what you bought, where you shop, your age. If they can't get medical information right now because of HIPAA, but boy, if they could, they would. So that's, and not just politicians. Walmart wants to know, why did you buy what else could we target at you? So if they knew that a guy with green shirt and sneakers is more likely to buy Pop-Tarts, they would find a way that whenever that guy walked in the store, he'd get a little thing that pops up on his cell phone saying, special today, 2 cents off Pop-Tarts, which would be great for him, it feels like, but you're like, wait, what other information they have, right? So when we've read about the NSA collecting all this information about everything we've done online, we start to feel, it doesn't feel right. We didn't put that information there for those purposes. So a whole nother dimension of this that's being discussed, and they allude to a little bit, is the issue of control of information. When I ask you for some information, if you want to buy this product, give me these, you want to join something online now, they always ask you, give me your email, a little bit of background, things like that. Well, that's because that lets them say, the guy who did this also did this, also did this. So they sell that information to each other. Now that doesn't feel bad to us because they're mostly using it to advertise, to change pricing, things like that. Might make you feel a little more uncomfortable if I tell you that when you go to an online site and see a price, that price has been carefully calculated for you. You don't necessarily see the same price everyone else does. Right? They're taking your history, what else you've bought, where you've been, who your friends are, all the information they can get about you and saying, this guy will pay us a little more for those sneakers, right? Than this other person we don't have a reason to believe, or maybe less, right? So it can also work in your favor. They're saying, this is someone who I think is very likely to buy these things, so let me do it. I have a particular shoe I was having trouble finding because of an orthopedic problem. One day, an ad for those shoes showed up next to my email. I grabbed it, right? It saved me money. I have no idea whether I'm paying the same as anyone else or less than anyone else or different, because I have no, the only thing I could do is go out and say, hey, does anyone else buy these shoes? What's it telling you? That's data again. So in fact, that's happening now too. There are websites you can go to saying, I'll tell you when I'm being charged for things if you'll tell me, and the website gets 1,000 people and says, here's what's going on. So there's a site which will tell you, if you want to fly somewhere, it'll say, the best time to buy tickets from Albany to San Francisco is Tuesday afternoons at 3 p.m., right? You'll get a lower price than if you buy at any other time of the week, right? How do they know that? Again, they're looking at all these things. So at some point, though, we want to start saying, when I give you information, instead of this 20-page long legal document that no one reads, they say, do you agree? You click yes. The average time is going down. The amount of time till that click is getting shorter and shorter, and was already under a second the last time the averaging was done. So we know nobody is reading those things. I tried reading them for a while because I got into this stuff, and I thought, I'd be really curious what they're saying. And first of all, you need a law degree to understand them. Luckily, I was working with a colleague at the time who had a law degree. And I would send, but it turned out you can't live. I would get things from I got a thing from MIT saying, we're thinking about bringing this student in. What do you think of them? And I clicked on the terms and agreements. It says, we can sell your data to anyone we want. We just won't tell them what you said about this individual student. I'm like, how much will you pay me for that data? Right? So I called MIT. I said, I will mail you a letter. I will not use your online system. Right? And I said, but I don't want it to count against the candidate, but I don't want them selling. So learning what our data is used for, controlling it, that's another thing they allude to a little bit, but that seems to be another big issue. So to summarize, because I'm talking probably much longer than I should, the themes of this book is more data is being collected. It's being correlated in new ways. That gives us a tremendous amount of power. But it comes at the cost of this potential violation of our privacy or use of data for things we don't know. Excuse me, I'm just going to pull one thing to finish my talk. I mentioned that I knew the guy who wrote the book, so I sent him a message saying, what should I tell the audience today? Right. So anyway, so first thing is that. Second thing is by collecting this data for the purposes of doing things with it, those kind of analyses, we can also go further and use it for other things, often good things, but potentially problematic things. And the third is that there are these privacy threats and prediction threats and things like that we got to think about. So my conclusion from reading this, and they don't quite say it so strongly, is what they're really saying is you need to understand this stuff if you're going to be a citizen of the world we're starting to live in. And this isn't a world 100 years from now or 50 years from now. It's the world starting now, but growing quickly. Because remember what I said about that doubling. Right? So that means as much as they're collecting this year, next year 2 times as much, year after that 4 times as much, in 10 years 1,000 times as much. Right? So we need to start understanding as citizens what's going on. And that's why books like this are so important. I actually recommend it highly. So anyway, so I said, Ken, what should I tell these people at the library? And he said, tell them this. We're at the outset of the revolution. So everyone can probably think of unique uses in their own domains, in the own things you do. So in other words, they're really saying that, another thing to start thinking about is the fact that as these tools become easier and easier to use and assess. So right now, to really do this big data stuff at its super form, you need to come over to RPI and use our supercomputer and get a few of our mathematicians to help you. But we're starting to train students who know how to do it. Colleges are teaching it now. Soon it'll be in the high schools. Right? So this notion, you'll be able to go to a website and say, here's the stuff I'm interested in, here's the data I'm looking for, what would it tell me? So he's saying, you really can, the good part of this, so he's a big proponent. You can say I'm sort of mixed-minded this. No, this stuff's great, let's go full speed ahead. So he would say, start learning this stuff because it's going to be something that can change your life in a positive way, which I agree. But I'd also say start learning this stuff because it's also going to be things where political decisions made in the future will hang on what people know, how they know it, how they got the data. It's all legal, so we're not talking about legality at the moment. We're talking about ethics. We're talking about, what's right and wrong, and what do we as a society want to think about the world of big data. So I'll stop there. Thanks. And I don't know how you do this. Q&A or please questions? Yeah.
The terms data warehousing, data mining, and some other terms. Can you flesh that out for us a little bit?
Well, I can give you a couple of the biggies, and then you can ask about other ones. So data warehousing is traditionally collecting a lot of data into one place. And it's traditionally meant either a particular kind of machine or set of machines or things like that. So you'd say the government has, so New York State has a data warehouse where all of the DMV information goes. So when you go and you buy your driving record, they go to a computer and they type some stuff and out comes the thing that says you had 2 speeding tickets and whatever else. So that's kept in this thing called the data warehouse. Or at our university, I can go to the data warehouse and say, what was, my grant was charged $27 yesterday for something. What was it? And come back and I'll say, okay, this purchase was made at this time. That kind of thing. So it's the storage of the data. Now that's organized data. So typically when we talk about a data warehouse, we don't talk about something like Google or Facebook, which has all this other kind of data. Who knows who? what text, documents, things like that. So the data warehouse tends to be the collection place for organized data. Data mining, again, traditionally is looking at the data either in a data warehouse or some other data repository, and it's very much doing that kind of thing I mentioned before, finding the pattern. So to differentiate, traditionally databases we've approached, or warehouses we've approached for a query. I go to it and say, why did I find this $27 taken out of my account? And it says, because this purchase was made at this place. So it answers my question. But now what can happen is someone else at the university can look at it and say, what were all our purchases? And do we see a place where we seem to be spending a lot of money where maybe we could make it cheaper? Or are we, our campus has moved to a travel system where we all have to use the same one because they realized we weren't getting a discount that we could get at bulk that we couldn't get as individuals. Most of us hate it. Now it's getting better because they're actually using our feedback. So all of a sudden the data is being used in a good way, whereas originally it was used to do something else. So mining is that bottom-up thing. You go say, here's all my medical data, what can you tell me? And the problem is usually it comes back with something like, well, if someone coughs, they have a cold. You say, okay, don't tell me the obvious stuff. It says, okay, if someone's named Joe Smith and he lives at this address and he came in on Tuesday the 3rd, then he has gout. And you say, no, that doesn't help me either. I want some patterns. So the trick is finding the right levels of these things and getting the right kind of data and bringing the other stuff you know about the world. Okay, so the database Walmart was using didn't say this is a hurricane. It said these 3-day periods we seem to be doing things, and the Walmart guys went to a bunch of stuff and said, what's going on? And somebody said, that was Hurricane Irene. That was Hurricane Sandy. That was Hurricane something else down in Louisiana. We're seeing hurricane as a pattern. But it took someone knowing that. Now you can bring more data in and start to do some of that. So data mining is sort of the automated part of that, the get me what things correlate with what. And then sort of the human part that comes on is what, either explaining that or using that. Okay, so those are your biggies. Now then the other, let me just add a third one for 1 second. Third one is web data, or data out not in your warehouse. So for example, you can go to the New York State Open Data site, which is started about a year ago. Truth in Advertising, I'm about to be asked to be an advisor to the project, but the hundreds of data sets. But the problem is it's not very helpful. So you say, I want to know where I can get a job, and it says, here's the job data. But someone like me or a developer or something can come along and say, hey, I see a way to make some money. I will write a program that helps people tell me about themselves, and then I'll match them to this job data and say, people like you seem to be getting jobs in this industry, in this place, with this kind of background. Okay? Now suddenly that data has become very valuable to you. So data has to come through this middleman kind of apps. But putting the data out there, not in a warehouse, but in the open, is another big trend we're seeing. And they talk a little bit about that much. Let me take someone else's and I'll come back. Yeah.
How do you get rid of data that you don't want? I was in this thing called Match.com, and I didn't want anyone else to. So on my Facebook, I get 100 Japanese women looking for you over 50, this, that, and the other, and I don't want it. And I get like about 10 of them a day. So basically, I don't know how to get rid of it. And I also, another thing, I got this Zorpia. Some people said, you told me to take this diet pill, and I didn't, I'm not fat. And she was angry. I said, I don't even want Zorpia, so I said, don't send me anything. And I still get things from them. How do I get rid of it?
Well, who's got an easy question? No. Actually, that's one of the ethical dimensions of this, right? There is no forgetting, in a sense, on the web. Online in these data warehouses. Once it's in there, you got to get it taken out. Now there are ways of doing that, and there's things you can do. If you go to your browser, somewhere you'll find something called private browsing, which says when I go to a site, you're not allowed. You're not keeping it in my browser, so when I go to so part of how that works right now is you don't realize it, but whenever you go to a site, it can stick something into your browser so that when you go to another site, it looks for it, and businesses make deals. So Google knows that you went to Best Buy and bought this thing, not because Best Buy calls them up and says, hey, Google, he bought this, but because the next time you go to do a search, Google tests and say, oh, look, he was at Best Buy. He was, and Amazon, and not just big guys, hundreds and hundreds, you bought shoes. So that kind of stuff is being collected. Now, how do you make it go away? Well, one is to hide it, so you can do a little bit of that. One is to sort of have some faith that most of the time it's just not being used for bad stuff. And then when it is being used for bad stuff, it's the same thing when you get bad junk mail. You got to tell someone, you got to ignore it, you delete it. So there are services that help do some of that. But roughly speaking, this is actually a dilemma. And there's another book, I'm blanking on its name, but it's called something like Delete or something. And it's all about how we as, how important it has been to us as a society that we can forget things. Right? How can you, he talks about when the whole world used to be small towns and somebody did something bad, they had to leave town because no one would ever forgive them or ever forget. Right? Now our whole world is becoming like that. I go online, I Google you, and I say, oh my God, this guy's looking at all these Japanese women. And it's not true, but I can't tell. So that is actually an ethical dilemma that's being explored. And I wish I could give you a good answer. But when you do see it, a lot of the time you don't look carefully. Somewhere at the bottom of the page it says, if you don't want this, click this. Are we bothering you? Click here. If Google has a thing where it says, if you have Google Mail, it says, if you didn't like this mail, you can delete it, but you can also say report spam. Now, when you report spam, it doesn't mean you'll never see that mail again. It means that when the 1 million people have told them there's a spam, they'll make sure that never gets to anyone again. So it's the power of crowds, but you have to do it. Sorry, you were next. Yeah.
My question involves too much data. We've come to find out that the NSA has been collecting phone records and email reading our email, or at least knowing who's sending what to who. And they have trillions of records over at least 5 years, is what I've heard. Yet the Boston bombers walk into a thing and they set off a bomb. And so how useful was that data? And there's other instances of these things beside the Boston bomber.
Right.
So how do you reconcile that?
So the argument that the NSA makes is exactly that problem. They say, if we have enough data and we use this predictive stuff, then we are stopping terrorists before they happen. And we're not 100%, so the fact that you see 1 or 2 instead of seeing 100 means we're winning. Problem is they don't tell you what the 98 that you didn't see were, and so it's hard to know. So that's the argument in that case. But again, you see this in places where they are transparent, where they're saying, gathering this data, we're seeing these patterns, we're doing that. The other thing is, I would counter with the Boston bombing that one thing that was very different this year is after the bombing, instead of the police keeping everything secret, they went out with what they knew. And within a week, within hours, they knew who had done it. So they looked at a whole lot of cameras, and in the old days they said, okay, we see somebody who looks like this, and then the police would have figured out who it is. Now they went online and they said, does anyone know who this is? And they started getting a lot of bad reports, but a lot of good reports, and the good reports started to outweigh the bad reports. And they said, okay, now we know who the bomber was. So again, data works in a lot of different ways. The other thing is we're not very good at video data. So all these cameras you see everywhere now sort of scare me with how much people know where I am and what I'm doing, but putting that together is still very hard. We're getting better at it. Right? The NSA is collecting a lot of that data, doesn't actually know how to analyze it yet, but they're betting on the fact that in 2 years or 4 years, they will be better at analyzing. So the more they save, the more they'll be able to look at later. Again, for better or worse, and it depends whether you think about privacy as the thing you're trying to protect, or terrorism or whatever is the thing you're. Law enforcement is using their data a lot now. At some point, you start to say, I feel I'm not bad with NSA using my email to protect me from. From terrorists, but I'm getting a little nervous about, law enforcement reading my email to decide if I'm a drunken driver, even though I've never had a drunken driving conviction, and I don't drink and drive, but, maybe they're going to think so because of some pattern that I act, because of the green shirt and the sneakers. So again, very complicated things. I'm seeing a lot of hands. You had a hand up a minute ago. No?
Well, I did, but one thing he was asking about how to get rid of all of this stuff is get a good cookie cleaner for your computer.
Yeah. So in your browser, there's something called cookies. Those are how the how those guys make deals with each other. So what I can do is I can either turn it off or I can periodically go and clean it out. However, I will tell you not as much useful as it used to be. So I put a brand new browser and I have some software that will actually count those things and do it. Before I had even clicked on the first link, there were 75 things in there. So they're finding you now rather than waiting for you to, but it does help. But it does help.
What you have, anything you put your name on, read the very fine print for the phone number that you can opt out of. I had that with the AARP, and I think that's how the Meddler and a few other things got my number to bother me with all these scams and things.
Although some of it is, a lot of people are claiming they get your data that way, but are actually scam artists and
I
things.
figured that out myself because once I called.
No, I understand. Okay. Yeah, but it turns out, but sometimes that's real, and yes, you should always look for those numbers and report it. But the other thing going on is this is becoming a cat and mouse game between, quote, the good guys and quote, the bad guys. So what happened so a bunch of people were getting phone calls saying, the Med-Alert thing you ordered.
17 phone calls.
Right. So it turns out that's a national scam. But they've stopped mostly now because they're going down. No, I can tell you they're going down because there used to be this many a day and now it's that many being reported. Because as people started being told about it and the word went out, so now you go to a site that scopes or something, you'll say, don't click, they're not real. Right. But it's hard. It's getting harder and harder to know what's real and not. This is a big area of computer research right now is how to control that. Yeah, you're next.
In addition to thinking about this as a problem, and it might be, I remember back more than 50 years ago when government was making decisions based on data. We still had data. And when you have little data, then it's much more likely that private opinions enter into what you're going to wind up doing. The joke at DPW, now called DOT, used to be that all you need are 2 points of data, and you put your trend line through one, and you argue why it doesn't go through the second point.
So now we do that with 5,000 points, and we still have the same argument. And more sophisticated curves and things. But it is
to really get it badly.
Right. So somebody once asked me, how do I feel about the whole PRISM thing, the whole collection of data? And I'm like, in some ways it makes me very nervous, but in other ways it actually makes me feel more secure because they've got information on everyone. They're not going to find mine by accident as much as they might if they were sampling. So what's more likely now is they're going to be looking for someone, and that might accidentally be me or not, but they have to come looking because in that statistical noise, the chances of finding something. So it used to be if you emailed someone your Social Security number, that was a real risk because there weren't that many people who were sophisticated about email. And there were guys out there looking for things that looked like Social Security numbers. Now, there's so many things coming by that would fool you into thinking you're Social Security number. There's so many safeties and things. The amount of noise so far outweighs the amount of positives that people just don't use it anymore. They find other ways to steal your Social Security numbers. Right. So again, as with any technology, as we get more of this stuff, some things get better, some things get worse. Some people are using it for good reasons, some people are using it for bad reasons. But just as learning about the nuclear threat 50 years ago became a good way, you had to understand it if you were going to be a citizen in the modern world, right? You could ignore it and just hope everyone else got it right, which is what most of us are doing about data, for that matter, what most of us still do about the nuclear threat. But at least knowing what it was and being able to read the paper and say, okay, this scares me. We're now reading about Syria and chemical. We've been kind of learning about chemical weapons since they last were used in the battlefield. We're starting to think about it, whether we're informed or not. We can have a different argument, but again, I think this data stuff is something that will be a big part, if not our lives, our kids' lives. Okay, your grandkids' lives, no one here is old enough that your grandkids won't be so affected by this, even if your grandkids are my age, let alone younger and younger. So this really is a growing area of concern. I think you were next. Yeah.
Where do you think traditional database systems are going? The relational technology, with all this big data comes all these newer disruptive technologies that are changing your bread and butter systems that have been around for 20, 30 years.
So let me give you a very fast answer and then say, come talk to me after if you want more details. So that's a good question right now. So at the moment, the relational data is still primarily being used. However, as you start moving to web scale, you're getting into what we used to call sparse databases, so new tools. So that's why you hear things like NoSQL or RDF. So there's some new technologies that are starting to come up for handling this very big scale stuff. From an external point of view, it's still collecting the data and questioning it. From an internal point of view, it's a very different management thing. So the betting at these days is the database administrator 15 years from now will have to know a lot more than the database administrator now to really. 2 years, well, now from 5 years ago. I mean, so again, this is a growing thing, but right now, most of the government data is still in relational form. Some of that is changing slowly. Document data is starting to come in. Documents don't live in relational form very well. So you have what's called metadata. So there's I mean, this is my research area. I'm not too worried about something being put out of business when I do research in this area, because it's a hard, fast-changing area with a lot going on. And again, I'll be happy to get specific after.
I have a suggestion how the individual should respond when you're asked for something that you hesitate. Let's say that you're said, we need to know your date of birth, and you don't want to give that, and then they say, well, then we can't help you.
Right.
How can we respond?
Well, you know, that's a problem. Okay, so the answer is most of us have got conditioned to giving it without asking that question. Right? So you go into Radio Shack and they say, can we have, you know, you buy something and they say, what's your zip code? You're allowed to say no. If they say, I'm sorry, I can't sell it to you without your zip code, you probably don't know that you can tell them they're violating the law. Okay? However, there are places where they can ask you for certain kinds of information, and you do have to do it. So if you buy a telephone and they ask you for your social security number, you can't have a phone without it. And in fact, you'll find it most, if you go to AT&T's website or something, right after they do it, there's a little star, and if you click on the star, they say, this is why we're collecting this data, and this is why we want to know. So the more reputable and larger something is, the more likely they'll tell you when so Radio Shack, you know, whether the individual employee knows or not, the store manager knows. But online, it's hard to tell, things like that. You know, they have, I mean, the problem is there isn't a great answer for that, but questioning it and making your own decision. And at some point you say, you know, I do want this thing, but I don't want to give them my date of birth, and they won't give it to me. You say, okay, I'll find a competitor who won't ask for my date of birth. And if they're not willing to go somewhere else, and then they'll stop asking. You know, if 100 of us walk into the same store and say, I'm not buying here because you're asking for my date of birth, they'll stop asking for the date of birth. Unless they're required to have it, in which case they'll tell you I'm required. But you know, but some of this stuff is weird. There's a wonderful little video going around about, you know, why do you have to turn off your cell phone when you get in an airplane, right? And it's a great little video. And you know, the stewardess is sort of giving all the normal answers, and each time she says, you know, the people in the airplane nod, and then someone says, but wait, what about? And then it starts again. Finally, she says, you know, it's just magic. The airplane, we don't know how airplanes work, and this stuff could cause them to crash. But in reality, I mean, it's a legal system that's been created. There are technical reasons why that started. Why it persists has to do with law and nothing to do with actually, a very little to do with the technology and the technology problem. Okay, so again, these things change over time. Law changes very slowly compared to the speed the web and things change. And so, unfortunately, at the moment, we are a market, and we need to think about that. But you alone, not giving your date of birth, isn't going to be as effective if you go out, you know, get other people to start agreeing and to start telling them. You know, in the old days, we used to send a lot of letters to someone saying, we don't like what you're doing, and sometimes they would change their behavior. The equivalent of letters now has to be to sort of email the place or call them. How much could you do that for the date of birth? You know, how much is it worth to you? These things get very hard, but the more we understand what giving that piece of information means and why, then it starts to get more serious. And then sometimes you can say, you know, this is one where I don't think I want to give that.
I would like to revisit this Boston bomber idea because of what I perceived as an inherent skepticism of the value of the use of big data. And these guys slipped through the crack. It should be realized they were unaffiliated. And that was privately planned by the two of them. And so they didn't have to communicate with anybody. Therefore, all of this collecting of data on communications was meaningless with respect to the Boston bombers because they weren't communicating with
Yeah,
anybody.
yeah. So here's the thing. If I understand how the data is being collected and how it's being used, and I'm a bad guy, then I can put a lot of effort into not doing it. However, that's hard. Okay, so you know, but that's why, for example, after 9/11, right? People knew this pretty quickly, and it took the report about 3 years to come out and say it officially. But what we know is that the problem was that people weren't sharing enough information, that the information was in the system that we could have caught those guys. But it was this organization knowing some people seemed to be training for pilots but not interested in actually getting a pilot license. And this organization knowing that somebody had been seen scoping this. And this organization knowing that money was moving in a certain way. And so the argument was if the people who had so that's the FBI, the CIA, the banking system said, you know, this was all available to the government, but we didn't put it together. So the argument for PRISM, and it's actually where that program comes from, was the argument that if we put it together, we'll do a better example. So then how does the Boston bomber come in? Well, now the next Al-Qaeda knows that, so they're going to be much more careful. So they're going to try to talk off-band. They're going to only use things that, so that's why the argument is that Snowden is a traitor, right? So some of us think Snowden is a hero because he exposed to us what this is, and others think Snowden is a traitor because now he's told Al-Qaeda what we know, so it'll be easier for them to do it without being in the right, you know, without being seen. You know, which is correct? Well, I don't think it's a correctness. I think it's a you know, a complex issue. And again, the book will help you understand some of what's going on in that issue and how to think about it without having to know the math and the details and things like that. And that's kind of why I, you know, again, I would actually, you know, I don't think I'm supposed to give recommendations things, but I would give the book to the, you know, the 2 thumbs up because, as I told you, there's things in here that I, as a data scientist, have some problems with. But it's mostly because they simplify some things that are more complicated. But the things they discuss are a great way to get a good feel for what. You've had a lot of concerns in your questions. Reading the book, I don't think will make you feel better. It will just make you understand better how to answer some of those questions. Why are they collecting that data that you don't want to give? How do people get away from it? Why didn't we find the Boston bombers? This book will actually help you at least understand that, and in a way that doesn't require coming back. Any of you who wants to come back to university and give us a lot of money and train up, we're happy, but this will at least get you started for a lot less money. So, thank you.
So thanks for coming.